welcome to Badan Warisan Malaysia's talk series for Spotlight in Sarawak, #Talk Sarawak, that's TOK Sarawak. The second installment for our 6-part talk on Sarawak's unique and diverse heritage. Spotlight in Sarawak was organized in conjunction with World Heritage Day 2022 and is curated by our live members, Tan Sri Mogi and Tan Sri Elizabeth, with the support of leading academics and heritage specialists from Malaysia and beyond. Last week at the launch of the Talk Sarawak series by Tan Sri Mogi, we were extremely pleased by the excellent response to Dr. Robert Manoa Saleh's most enlightening and insightful talk about the heritage of Sarawak's traditional longhouses. We are extremely grateful that we are able to present this program in partnership with Patriot Energy, supported by donors Creador Foundation, Cahaya Mata Sarawak Berhad, Coke Private Equity Sindiran Berhad, and Centric PR Sindiran Berhad. As the president of Badan Warisan Malaysia, I have the privilege today to introduce today's moderator, Mr. James Yong. Mr. James S.L. Yong is currently the president of the Sarawak Heritage Society, SHS. SHS is a non-government, non-partisan, and non-profit organization focused on raising awareness of Sarawak's heritage and advocating for its sustainable conservation and protection. James is also a member of the Sarawak Heritage Council, which was formed to advise the government on matters of policy, strategy, or plan of action relating to the administration and management of heritage and conservation areas in Sarawak. He's currently in the midst of conducting research on a book which focuses on the history of Padungan, an important heritage area in Kuching, Sarawak, Malaysia. It also facilitates a UNESCO masterclass on heritage site management. When not working on heritage matters, James Yong runs JY Global Associates, an independent consulting outfit which focuses on strategy, tech management, business models, and process streamlining for organizations. Please welcome Mr. James S.L. Yong. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei Ling, for the kind introduction. Good day to everybody. Let me add my warm welcome to all participants, wherever you are logging on from. Let me first introduce Dr. Valerie Mashman. Valerie is currently Associate Research Fellow at the Institute of Borneo Studies, University of Malaysia, Sarawak, or UNIMAS. Prior to this, she was a Research Fellow at the Sarawak Museum. Her research interests in the field of anthropology examine the issues of oral history and narratives, values and social change, indigeneity, and material culture, with a particular focus on indigenous peoples of Borneo. She is currently working on a book based on her PhD, which analyzes Kalabit notions of value and historical change through a 3-part oral history. She has contributed many papers, which I will not go into the details. You can read in the slide here. I just want to mention that in my own personal library that you can see behind me, one of her books is Sarawak Cultural Legacy, which she co-edited with the late Lucas Chin, director of the Sarawak Museum, and is one of my prized possessions. It's very difficult to find these days. So before I hand over to Dr. Valerie, I would just like to remind the audience to send in their questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to answer as many as we can later at the end of Valerie's presentation. You can also send your questions and comments in the chat box if you like. So without further ado, we welcome Dr. Valerie to begin her presentation. Valerie, over to you.
Thank you, James. You can all see my screen?
Yep.
My talk today is entitled The Legacy of Regatta, Peacemaking in the Baram. And the outline goes something like this. We'll look at the background to the regatta. We'll talk about the Baram resident, Charles Hose. We'll look at the regatta and the 1899 peacemaking. We'll look at the legacy of peacemaking and the legacy of the Baram Regatta with local testimonies. So I'd say something about regattas in Sarawak in general. The Baram Regatta, held in April 1899 with the Marudi Peacemaking, was not the first in Sarawak. There were boat races described as early as 1861 in Kuching, and the New Year's Day Regatta became a regular event in Kuching. Boat races became a feature of upriver bazaar life, and this continued very much into the 1980s. Charles Brooke understood that the boat races had a positive effect on social relationships. To quote from 10 Years in Sarawak, "This spectacle and the general meeting has a good effect on all the natives and tends to excite a kindly feeling among all parties." The first recorded regatta for the Baram district is 1890. And sorry, I've jumped a slide. This is a map showing the Baram district. We've got Miri on the coast, which is now the seat of the resident, and Marudi, which is the headquarters for this huge hinterland that was riverine. People would travel by boat up the Baram to get to the Calabit Highlands and beyond over the border into the Apokayan and Bahau areas. And you've got the Tinjar River on this side, and you've got Brunei very close by. The first regatta that was held in Marudi was in 1890 at the fort on New Year's Day. Some 3,000 people attended. This was some 7 years after the Baram had been ceded by Brunei to the Brooke administration in Sarawak. The fort had been erected on a prominent hill, and the bazaar was in process of being built. The purpose of the regatta was to make up old quarrels between the Baram peoples and those of the Tinjar and the Tuto. 30 jars of borak were consumed. So you can see from the very beginning, the regatta was a more than event. It was more than boat races. It was an opportunity for peacemaking and general festivity. The local chiefs were ready to create more alliances, which would facilitate smooth journeys and easy trade networks. I'm now going to say something about Charles Hose, the resident, because it's through the writings of Charles Hose that we get a good picture of the regattas in the Baram in this early phase. And the establishment of the resident in the Baram and the abolition of headhunting brought about a new era on the Baram. Charles Hose quickly rose in the Sarawak administration to be resident at the age of 28 in 1891. This position enabled him to pursue his passionate interest in natural history and ethnography. He saw himself as a student of local customs, fostering enlightened colonial rule. He's said to have promoted respect for native cultures in a way that was atypical of his colonial contemporaries. At the same time, he was not against the use of force to deal with people who rebelled against Brooke's rule. He left a legacy of his descriptions of the cultures and inhabitants of the Baram district in his books and in his accounts of natural history, albeit through his own colonial perspective. He collected thousands of cultural objects, photographs and specimens that grace the museums of United Kingdom, Europe, and the Sarawak Museum. Hose actively cultivated connections with international scientists, which helped him to improve his skills and affirmed his position as a gatekeeper to those who sought to go on scientific expeditions to the Baram. A visitor from the US, Furness, wrote about Hose's house in Marudi in 1896. It was surrounded with a broad veranda whereon were scattered, in confusion characteristic of a naturalist, all sorts of specimens, snakes, fish, scorpions, animals in jars of alcohol, dried turtles, skulls of wild pigs and rhinoceroses, and on tables and chairs, ornamented shields and sun hats of the natives decorating walls. Hose went on to work very hard to persuade one of the leading anthropologists of the day, A.C. Haddon, together with his colleagues from Cambridge University, to stop off at Borneo on their way back from their expedition to the Torres Straits. Hose did his utmost to arrange the programme to the smallest detail for his distinguished visitors from Cambridge University, to plan the native spectacles that the party were to experience down to the smallest detail. So here you can see a picture of Hose's veranda with a stuffed turtle and artifacts on it. These were being obviously prepared for packing. This is a photograph taken by A.C. Haddon. And I want to take a quote from Hose. In July 1898, Hose wrote to Haddon, "I've arranged for a peacemaking to take place, the like of which will never take place again in Borneo, I should say. And you will see and hear what very few have ever seen, and you will soon understand how I manage these people." He coordinated the Great Peacemaking of 1899, which was to take place in Haddon's visit. He relished the phase of preparation, describing the competition between villages in making their boats. Rumours abounded over rivals' designs and skills in boat making. Hose built his reputation on this event. In 1900, he gained an honorary doctorate from Cambridge, his old university, where he'd failed to complete his degree. And Rani Margaret praised him for achieving the civilization of the Baram people. However, although Charles Hose appears to be the architect of peacemaking, a closer look at events from a local perspective will show that peace was achieved through the efforts of local leaders such as Tama Bulan. So we've got the regatta program, which has been preserved in the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology in Cambridge. And looking closely at the regatta program, we can see that the peacemaking in 1899 was carefully organized to maximize the participation of local chiefs in the management of the event. They were made into judges, stewards, and umpires alongside the Brook officers. The whole idea behind the regatta was to provide an alternative to headhunting for an energetic, ambitious men aspiring to fame. This regatta was the climax of other peacemakings held in the Baram district over previous years in 1895 onwards. And here we can see a close-up of these programs. So we've got reference to the judges, the referee, umpires, and the starter and the stewards, and the whole community was drawn into the organization and the committee for the event. So we've got gentlemen from the Chinese bazaar, we've got local leaders, and we've got some of the local Malays taking part. And we've got other people's names mentioned, and I've listed them all later on in another slide, because there's a lot of aspiration to see who are the people in the front lineup of the photograph. And we've got details of the races. So if we look at the event, on the first day, there's sports, there are races for war boats, the prizes are mentioned, and we see the Narom got the first prize, and then there are diversions such as the coconut shy and the swinging basket and the greasy boon. There are obstacle races and flat races and other boat races. And to quote Hose again, he talks about a peacemaking the like of which will never take place again in Borneo. However, there was a foundation made for events that continue even today. The regatta is held every 3 years. The last regatta was in 2017, and the 2017 regatta still proudly held an agricultural show, and there were fireworks at night. So one event that was held was tuba fishing on an inland lake on the 11th of April, 1899, and the boat races were held on the 12th of April. And on the 13th of April, there was the big peace conference in the temporary conference hall. The preparation took over a year and brought many people together. And this idea that you have to prepare at least a year ahead still continues with the Baram Regatta, and it does bring many people together. The trade generated by the event were very important because after the event, people paid their taxes. There was sponsorship by the local Chinese community and the Brook officers, and sponsorship is another important factor. And the tuba fishing, for the tuba fishing, some 25 people of tuba was provided by the natives from all over the district. The tuba was root that was put in the river, which poisoned fish, and people were able to catch lots of fish, which they then would eat. Here you can see an important boat. This was possibly Charles Hose's boat on the river. And Haddon goes on to describe dragons on the river, the figureheads on the war boats. He says, so here you can see the figurehead on a war boat in an old photo. And Haddon goes on to describe how he sees, first rounding the corner, as if it were peering through the foliage, would appear a grotesque head of what seemed to be a monstrous dragon with long sharp tusks, goggle eyes, and erratic horns, but the long thin neck resolved itself into the bow of a war canoe. And here we can see more pictures of these figureheads that are now in the British Museum. And these wooden figureheads on the end of a war boat are carved to resemble the spirit of the water in the form of a dragon, serpent, or crocodile. The spirit of the water is thought to be present in the movement of the river and to cause war boats to be upset and drownings. By putting this figurehead on the end of the boat, people believed that the spirit of water would give them protection. So here's some lovely drawings from Haddon's book, Headhunters Black, White and Brown. And here's some counterpart figureheads in the British Museum. And here's some figureheads now erected in the Borneo Cultures Museum. And here's some figureheads from boats from the regatta in 2017. Here you can see cultural dances taking place on a war boat with this lovely big figurehead. Sorry, this is going backwards again. And I'd like to focus now on this Great Peacemaking in Marudi, which took place on the 13th of April, 1899. We can see this photograph in the Borneo Cultures Museum. It's given pride of place on a huge wall. And these two enormous figures are called the Bali Jawa. We'll come back to these wooden effigies a bit later on. We know that this gentleman here is Tama Bulan, and various local people give descriptions of their various ancestors being in this front lineup. I won't go into possible contenders for this. It's a very much a local thing. To talk about the peacemaking, over 6,000 people attended, bringing together different groups, those who were loyal to the Brooke regime, those who could be loyal, and those who were still engaged in warfare and were potentially rebellious. People came from outside the district, from the Balait and Tutong district of Brunei and the Apokayan in Dutch Borneo. And the main objective of the event was described as to encourage the Badan to be loyal subjects and to ensure a friendly recognition of them by the Baram people. The Badan people had just come into the Baram district as refugees. They had been driven out of their homeland, the Usunapau, in 1894 and 1895 by Brooke-sanctioned expeditions because they had been reluctant to pay tax to the Brooke government. Resident Charles Hose used this occasion to build on his reputation. There was Dr. Haddon and Dr. McDougall from the Cambridge expedition. There were local leaders, Sabah Irang for the Badang, Taman Oding Silong and Talam Balangdin for the Kenyas and Longpukun, Tamang Aping Buling and Jangan for the Tinja peoples, and Tama Bulan for the Baram peoples. Here we can see some photographs of people who attended the event. We've got Abantingan on the left and Tama Usong representing the Umapokayan on the right. And we've got a long list of names of people who attended that I've extracted from the programs. And we can see people represented from all parts of the Baram. From upriver, we've got Kayan and Kenya and Lirong and Kalabit. From around Marudi, we've got Tuanku Muda, and we've got Datu de Gadong, and we've got people from the Chinese community, such as Atong and Ahun and Atau. So these artifacts, the Bali Jawa, they're now in the Borneo Cultures Museum. They've been exhibited at the Sarawak Museum on and off over the years. And in recent years, they've been covered up. Or let's say their vital parts have been covered up. These wooden statues called Bali Jawa were carved for the Baram peacemaking in 1899. Before peacemaking could begin, between two hostile groups, a mock fight called a Jawa was held to dispel aggressive feelings. It was thought that these statues were carved to represent this ritual. These large statues are a bit of a mystery, as such effigies have not been recorded in other peacemakings. Rudimentary carving of such effigies was a feature in the rites of averting sickness and warrior initiation. And we have a description that at the other end of the hall was a gigantic, gaudily painted model of a hornbill, on which a very large number of cigarettes were suspended. The body was a large barrel. Each wing consisted of two hairy Kenya or Madang shields, and the head had been hewn out of a great block of wood by the Iban fortman. So you can see a photograph of this wonderful hornbill effigy. The hairy shields, there was a custom of actually putting tiny incisions in your shield, and the hair of your enemies would be threaded through. And this gave a certain power to your shield that would cause fear in the enemies. And there's some wonderful shields in collections in the Sarawak Museum and collections overseas. But let's just look at this wonderful hornbill effigy. We were really excited when we were looking for subjects for the New Borneo Cultures Museum, when we found in the store this hornbill head that came from this effigy. And you can see that this effigy makes us realize that the artifacts for the event were very much local hybrid artifacts. It was a local event based on local customs. And Paramount Chief Temongom Joseph Ngao Lian considered how the event must have entailed lengthy preparations by local chiefs based on the local adat. This would have involved checking the phase of the moon in advance, observing bird and animal omens, and making lengthy negotiations with the local chiefs. From the local perspective, the rituals and symbols of the event were made following customary law. There was a solid purpose and rationale for everything that was being undertaken. The huge penchalong, or hornbill, which was constructed with a head made by the Iban Fortman and Badan shields, imitated a Kenya and Badan custom of making hornbill effigies shaped like a bird about to fly out of whatever materials were available for festivals and meetings. And we also see in the picture of the Marudi peacemaking an Iban hornbill, which is now in the British Museum. So let's look at the rites of peacemaking. We've got the legacy of this photograph of Sabah Irang, the Badang chief, and the pig sacrifice. AC Haddon tells us that on the final day of peacemaking, on the 13th of April, after the boat races, everyone was summoned to the conference hall, which was an area covered by a roof of palm leaves. Chiefs were on one side of the central space on a platform, and the local people all about. In the center was a gaily painted effigy of a hornbill, one of the birds sacred to all tribes, and on it were hung thousands of cigarettes of homegrown tobacco wrapped in dried banana leaf. On a platform, there was an enormous pig with tied legs. Sabah Irang addressed the pig and swore he and his people would be friends with those present. The pig was killed by being speared in the neck and the liver examined. The shape of the liver was pleasing to everyone. After the speeches, people smoked cigarettes of good fellowship from the hornbill effigy, and they drank the long life and happiness to one another. Afterwards, there was singing in chorus. Everyone was reduced to boisterous conviviality. Wonderful description. So, but let's remember that peacemaking was something that was inherent in the adat of the Kenya, and the word patutong is used to describe the process. In the words of KK Peter Adam of Leo Matu, patutong means to make speeches, to take oaths, to eat together. You literally burn grudges. You tie the pig and you spear it. You look at the liver, you exchange objects, gongs and parangs. And here you can see the assembled Badang at the peacemaking. And so I'd like to make an assessment about Charles Ho's being the architect of peacemaking. He talked about it being a speculative experiment in peacemaking. The local chiefs were ready to create alliances, which would facilitate small, smooth journeys and easy trade networks. It was in their interest to promote peace and trade, as they could then acquire prestige goods that would boost their status. So peacemaking was less the achievement of Charles Ho's, but came about through the consistent mediation of local chiefs whose conduct influenced their followers. Charles Ho recognizes the effect of their influence. He says that Tama Bulan, and we've got this wonderful photo of Tama Bulan, spared no efforts in bringing about friendly meetings between the chiefs of different tribes for the purpose of making peace and promoting intercourse and mutual understanding. So this is a departure from the conventional view that the transformation of the Baram is generally attributed to Charles Ho's. This is because without Tama Bulan and the chiefs of the Baram district, the pacification of the Baram, which the climax was the regatta and grand peacemaking of 1899, would not have come about. The pacification of the Baram was a key period in the establishment of the state of Sarawak, and this essential local contribution has hitherto been underplayed in written histories of the state. So there was very much a legacy of this regatta, which came about through peacemaking. And peacemaking was a period that laid the foundations for the Brooke state and eventually the state of Sarawak as we know today. Peacemaking was very much a process that was documented by the officers of the Brooke state in the early 1840s to the 1924 peacemaking, which we got a photograph here at Capit, and peacemaking at Long Jawi in 1967. Peacemaking generated the legacy of sociality that people experience in Sarawak today. The easy partaking of regatta, festivals, and food that we'll hear about in the talks to come, between peoples of different traditions and religions. Peacemaking was based on local customary law, the adat, which has been codified as the basis for dispute resolution at the local level through our native courts in Sabah and Sarawak. Another aspect of our legacy is that the artifacts from the 1899 regatta were brought to Cambridge and the British Museum and the Sarawak Museum. So here we can see Tama Bulan's shield in Cambridge and Tama Bulan's hat, which is in the British Museum. Another legacy of regatta has been the making of alliances. So people remember very much how Sultan Abu Bakar was the first member of the Pahang royal family to attend the Baram Regatta in Marudi in 1973. And he was welcomed, as you can see here, in a very rich Orang Ulu tradition. And our former DO Stuart Ngau Ding recalled how they collected tuber roots in large quantities to use before the start of the regatta, and crushed roots were placed a mile upriver from Marudi so the stunfish would float downriver past the grandstand to enable hundreds of bystanders to scoop up the floating fish. Unfortunately, there was heavy rain and not enough tuber, but there were other events to entertain the crowd. For the night reception, Ngau Ding's wife, Magdalene, gathered all the Orang Ulu ladies in a mock royal marriage ceremony. Their son, Hudson, played the part of the groom, while his bride was a relative, Molly Belong. That was followed by a long dance led by the king, who donned a characteristic warrior's helmet called a tapong sake, while the queen and others followed behind in long procession. And so here you can see the king, the Sultan in 1973 being led in procession for the long dance. And in September 1982, Sultan Abu Bakar's son, who became the 7th young Dibatwa Agong, and his wife returned to Sarawak to be guests of honor at the Baram Regatta. And this tradition of alliances continued with the presence of the Sultan of Brunei, who came to grace the regatta in 2011, which was a really historic moment in the minds of local dignitaries and the peoples of the Baram. And it strengthened the bilateral relations between Brunei and Sarawak, while promoting both countries to the world community. And this event was attended by the governor and the chief minister of Sarawak. And People remember that Long Trawan successfully retained the Raja Batang Baram title for the second consecutive time after winning it in 2008. Another aspect of legacy is people remember all kinds of relationships between their fathers and grandfathers as sabila. Sabila is the custom of making blood brothers. And this flourished during peacemaking and a generation after. So here you can see the father of these Kenya brothers, Igang Ngarong and Jalon Balang from Long Jay, was a blood brother to a Kalabit headman, Tama Bulan. And here you can see his son, Ose Murang, talking to them. This meant that each man was granted reciprocally protection and safety by his blood brother and his longhouse. These men and their descendants still remember these kinship titles when they meet. And these gentlemen remembered the skill that they had to have in handling boats. Their longhouse was up in the upper Baram at Long Jay, and they shared. It's hard to grasp how difficult it was to come to Marudi in the old days when we were young in the 1950s. We had to paddle all their way. There was no boat engines. We came twice to the regatta with our elders. We were in a team together in a boat. That was before we were Christian. There were taboos. We would listen out for the omen boats, those signs that we would follow, so we wouldn't get trapped in bad weather. If the water was too high, we wouldn't go. Our ancestors came from the Apokayan for peacemaking. They came from the Usunapau and went to the Apokayan because of warfare. And we've got reminiscences from Orang Ulu women. Puan Ping Laing Anyi remembers going to the regatta in 1970. It was quite different from now. So many people from the Ulu came. We had to build a hut on the riverbanks to sleep. Our boat, Era di Madang, has a traditional name. It means bringing the news. It was the champion in 1982. We won the Agong's Cup. It belonged to KK Laing Ngo, Pamancha Gilbert's father. We gave Thanksgiving prayers and prayers before going in the boat. We had the pastors and deacons to pray for us. By this time, people were Christian. I used to row with the women. There are now plywood. She talks about there were now plywood boats and fiberglass boats that move faster. Some boats are owned by individuals, some by groups, and some are sponsored. The craftsmen who used to make the boats have all passed away. And another memory is the skill of the dancers. Jar Langub remembers that singing and dancing as particularly special. We used to have dance competition. There wasn't karaoke like there is today. The skill of the dancers was highlighted. They had to be very graceful. It was all in the way they moved their hands and feet and ankles. There was a very good female dancer from Longikang who won the prize. Sina Ribad, Maria Peter, a Kalabit, also won one year. The costumes were similar today, but with fewer shiny pieces. And another aspect of the legacy was the participation of school children. Datu Ose Murang remembers his first regatta. My first regatta was in 1970. I was a Form 4 student, and the headmaster wanted the school to participate in because the Sultan of Selangor was attending. The school organized a team and they had to build a boat from scratch near the school. We used a jelutong tree from the forested area of the school. That area was used for rearing animals. The older boys built the boat. Unfortunately, things were rather last minute, and the boat was rather wet. We hadn't burnt the wood to dry it out and make it lighter. It was still very heavy. We dragged the boat through to the airport, through St. Mark's down to the jetty. We pulled it through the peat swamp. We had no car. During the race, we didn't win. the experience was the effort made by the students. We played in the bamboo band for the arrival of the Sultan at the grandstand near the fort. The winners would come up the steps from the government jetty and they would go to the grandstand overlooking the river to receive their prizes. It was great fun for the students. Pengulu Joing Li Han remembers in 2017, he's the Panam Pangulu. He says it's a good event for us all to come together in the Baram. I'm pleased to see all the Panan coming from upriver to participate. They really work together. It's an occasion when we can meet all the YB and the government leaders easily. The first time I came was by boat with the people from Long Atip. I was about 25 years old then. I'm 70 now. I remember how much we used to enjoy watching the cultural activities, almost more than the races. There was music everywhere. Eileen Lau, a schoolgirl, remembers, I remember in the past Marudi was so full of people, there was nowhere to stay. There was a very special environment. You could hear music everywhere. We used to have the bamboo band. Here you can see a photograph of the Sabang bamboo band from Long Banga. You would hear sape music on the street corners. There was go-kart racing. People came jet skiing from Brunei. Our school had stalls for things to sell. We sold beadwork. Marudi is part of the history of the Sarawak for us. Another local lady, Betty Ongan, remembers when she was in primary 6. She says, we didn't stay in a hotel. We slept in the boat. I was with my parents. I just walked around. I watched people paddling the boats. There weren't many shops at the time. Yes, I remember my parents bought clothes and shoes. And Datin Catherine Awing remembers, my first regatta was in 1964. I had my first haircut, my first pair of sandals, and a new gown. My parents really worked hard to bring us there. They used to call the regatta Pase Alun. Pase means racing and Alun means boat in our language, which would be Brawan. That in Catherine's memories, she continues, we used to put a lot of energy into getting ready for the regatta. It was the one big event we'd all prepare and get ready for at least a year in advance. We'd really look forward to it. Our community used to camp on the banks of the river with the crew. We'd bring our own rice and cook for the crew. We wouldn't let anyone eat in Marudi Bazaar. We were apprehensive that our competitors might poison our crew or use black magic. That's what we believed in the old days. And we can see another aspect of legacy is the pride that participants, people coming to the regatta have in their costume. And this is a photo I took in 2017. We can see Awing Bilong, a Kenya lady from Long Mo, wears a tapong lunok, which is a Kayan headband widely used by the Kenya. Awing was born in 1930 and wove her headband herself some 6 years ago. It is quite a rare piece as not many people wear it nowadays. It's very finely woven from split rattan. She wears the headband for going out or hosting visitors at home in the longhouse. She doesn't wear it to the farm. And here we can see some photos that show the sense of unity and friendship that comes between the musicians who come together or the Kalabit Bamboo Band, who've all spent a long time rehearsing for this great event. And sorry, we see the lion dancers and the silat, young people practicing their silat to welcome the guests of honor. So I asked Temongong Joseph Ngao Lian, what does regatta mean? And you can see the Temongong as the main man in the front of this photograph in the foreground. He says the regatta has its own adat. It's a show of unity, an example of how we come together in peaceful times. It takes at least a year to have everything ready. Our boats come by boat from Lomsilat for 2 days. Our boat is called Amai Telangusang. It's a traditional name we used for the last regatta. Nowadays, there are not so many boats participating, as many of the regular paddlers have become very elderly, and the younger, able-bodied people are working outside the longhouse. They're not used to handling the boats and racing. The meaning of regatta means that there are intangible aspects of culture, that ideals and values are themes which recur in the preparation of the regatta. The important qualities of leaders, the customary law, the adat, which encompasses the values and ideals that bind communities together through genealogies, blood brotherhood, migrations, alliances, that make connections and link communities to wider domains. And I'll leave the last words to quote from His Excellency, the Governor of Sarawak. The atmosphere is uniquely different. The feeling is wonderful. The thing that makes the regatta unique is that people of different races come together to share a magical moment. Young and old come alike with smiling faces to celebrate a moment of togetherness, forgetting where they come from and even perhaps who they are, as they come to be part of this moment of magic. Thank you, everyone, for sharing this moment of magic with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Valerie, for your most enlightening presentation. I spent some years of my preschool days living in small towns within Sarawak, places like Sebuyau, Bintulu, and even in the Baram. And I remember, even as a small boy, watching boat races such as the regatta. So this presentation really brings back lots of memories to me. And I must go and fish out some of the old photographs from my parents' album that shows me at some of these regatta prize-giving sessions. Okay, I would like to invite the participants to hand in their questions, but let me start with one or two of my own. And the first one is basically just a question on how often are the regattas being held nowadays? Not just the Baram Regatta, but also Kuching and other places.
I believe the Kuching Regatta is every year, and the Baram Regatta tends to be every 3 years. But it also depends on how easy it is to get sponsorship and bring everyone together. So the last Baram Regatta was held in 2017, and that was when there was a Kuching Regatta. Gosh, I can't remember now the last Kuching Regatta. Maybe it was 2019 was the last Kuching Regatta.
Okay, yeah, I think I watched a bit of that as well. The other question I had was going through my mind was that, is regatta a term that is official? I mean, because what I observe is that many small towns, especially by the river or the sea, hold boat races and other festivities, and they call them regatta. So is there a regatta with a big R and a regatta with a small r in your observation?
Well, if you Google, I think the colonial officers had the precedent of the Henley Regatta, and there were probably boat races in Oxford and Cambridge and on the Thames. It was probably very much a 19th century tradition. Of course, regatta is an Italian word, and one immediately thinks of Venice. So I would say the term regatta has now become common in the English language.
Okay. Okay, let me turn to the questions that have been posted in the Q&A, and I would urge anybody else, any of the other participants who have questions, please just type them in there. The first one comes from Nu Akila, and he says, I would like to ask whether the artifacts on the shield, is that hair or human or animal fur on it?
Well, as I said, the old shields have got human hair. This was from the headhunting era. there were tiny incisions made on the shield, and resin was put in to make the hair. It was a very laborious process, and human hair was inserted.
Okay, so it is human hair. Mike Quet has this other question. In the old Sarawak Museum, there were 2 giant wooden effigies, more refinedly carved. Were these similar to the Baram Peacemaking effigies?
I'm not sure which effigies he's talking about. I understand these 2 peacemaking effigies were, the Bali Jawa, were kept in the old building by the staircase at one point. And perhaps they weren't wearing any clothes in a previous era, and people remember them with great affection. I believe it was considered auspicious to stroke certain parts of the effigy.
Yes, I remember that as a schoolboy. So do all my classmates, I'm sure. Anand Krishnan asked the question, are any of the old timber boats still around? I feel they are worth preserving.
That's a very good question. I believe there are old timber boats still around, still under longhouses, and that would be a fantastic project. What a wonderful idea to go about thinking about how to preserve them. An anthropologist called Ida Nicolaisen took a longboat maker to Denmark, and she had a project of the making of a longboat in Denmark, and she's documented this into a book. But perhaps we ought to document the making of a longboat as a documentary in Sarawak. And we definitely ought to think about preserving more of our old timber boats. That could be a project for the museum and perhaps the Heritage Society.
Interesting. Yes. Alistair Clare asked the question, who participated in past regattas from what is now Kalimantan? And did they bring their boats or make them on the way?
I have not got any records of people participating specifically from Kalimantan, but it's quite possible that participants in boats were people from over the border, because the border was very, very fluid until the 1950s and 60s. So that's a tricky question to answer. But having said that, we know that there were groups of people that came to Marudi for peacemakings in 1908, for example, from over the border. So we know that there were continuous peacemakings, but I'm not sure about how far they actually participated in boat races.
Mike Quet again has a question. Are there parallels between the regattas and the Chinese dragon boat races?
That would be a fantastic thing to look at. That would be a fantastic study. I don't know. I mean, we can see on the photograph these wonderful figureheads on the front of the Baram boats. And so, you know, there's a similar tradition among the Chinese with their dragon boats. Right. It'd be a fantastic thing to do, a comparative study.
Interesting, yeah. I never thought of that either, but you're right. Yeah, dragons in the front of both types of boats. Frank Saing asks, do you have any idea or record of the Kapit Regatta where peacemaking was also conducted?
I haven't looked that up. I dare say we could look at the Sarawak Gazettes for 1924 and see whether there was much about boat races for that time. I've really been limiting my own area of interest and study to the Baram, but I dare say if we looked at the Sarawak Gazette, we might find a bit more about the Gazette about regatta.
Right.
But from my memory, there's not very much about the regatta written up.
Okay. Then Greg Page Turner asked the question, are there any trophies that were awarded for the winners in the regattas during the Brooke era still used today? And if so, what form did they take? And were there silver trophies? Very specific.
That's a very good question. I don't think there are any trophies that come back to headquarters, so to speak. I don't think there are any original trophies that now come back to the Marudi district office or the Miri district office. My husband, who's been organizer of a number of these events, has never seen these old trophies. But I dare say that we could ask around our friends in the Baram and ask whether they have any original Brooke trophies. Sadly, there are a number of fires that take place and people don't have many things from the past left in their longhouses. But it'll be a very good thing to do, to ask around to see if anybody's got any old trophies in their longhouses.
I'm sure they are. Okay, the next question comes from Anthony Cooper. In the early photographs that you included, there was a noticeable absence of women. No photos of the women dancing or singing, and none of them attending the peace conference. What was their role in the 19th century?
That's a good question and a good point. I suppose paddling a boat vast distances was very much a men's enterprise. Men went on long journeys for fame and recognition, and that elevated their status. And possibly in the old days, if their longhouses weren't close to Marudi, the women were staying at home looking after their farms. I dare say the longhouses closer to Marudi, women did attend, but we don't see so many of them in the photos. For example, Tama Bulan is much photographed and talked about by both Hose and Haddon. And we've only got one photo of Bulan, but we never see any photos of Tama Bulan's wife. So it's true, we don't see many photos of the women.
Cameras were probably expensive as well. Rita Armstrong has the next question. Okay, let me read out her question. Thanks for an interesting history of the origins of regattas in Sarawak's history. My comments relate to the purpose of the 19th century regattas and also about horses' role in it. Firstly, the Madeng or Badeng were not pacified by such events, which demonstrates that while people might have joined the activities enthusiastically, they were not necessarily persuaded by ideologies about non-violence, even believed in the superiority of either Tama Bulan or the Brooke government. Secondly, would you agree that the government ideas about regattas and the goals of the indigenous elite, particularly the Kayan, were not mutually exclusive?
Okay, first question. Thank you, Rita, for making that point. Of course, the 1899 peacemaking was not a final event, particularly for the Badan. And there was quite a lot of warfare, coexistence with Iban, who were newcomers to the Baram, meant that there was a lot of warfare, and the Badang ended up going over to the Apokayan, and they only started to come back after the peacemaking at Long Jawi in large numbers. But so that helps us to think perhaps about the peacemaking in a different way if we look at this aftermath, and it's really the subject of another conference or another talk. So whether they weren't, I mean, you're talking about the goals of the Kayan. I don't think the Kayan at this time were necessarily the dominant group. I think possibly Tama Bulan was one of one of the dominant group at the time. And I think there were a number of circumstances that led the Badan and a very large group leaving the Baram and choosing to live outside Sarawak, although some of the Badang still settled at Leomatu and Longje. But I'd say this is a more complex subject that perhaps Rita and I ought to talk about another time.
Okay. Anand Krishnan asked the question, after each year's regatta and peacemaking meetups, how long before the tribe started fighting again?
Well, that's a good question. In 1903, there was, I believe it was 1903, there was an attack by Temongong Ko as a revenge attack to a petty murder. So there was constant warfare right up until the 1920s and 30s. There were minor petty attacks of revenge in local areas. But I think what happened after the Baram Regatta is more groups, after the Baram Peacemaking, there was a fort that was established at Leomatu, and there was more safe passage along the main Baram River as people began to settle on the main Baram River and travel the length of the river. Previously, there was a network of footpaths that have been little documented, and there were routes by foot across the Kalabit Highlands to the headwaters of the river. So there were forts in remote upriver places such as the Pata River that are little documented.
Next question by John Walker. During the Brooke period, winners were given sterling silver cups. I think this is in relation to a question earlier. So winners were given sterling silver cups. I have a trophy won at the Sadong Regatta, which I bought in 1992 on the main bazaar from the early 20th century. So it's a comment, not a question. So now,
oh, that's interesting. That's interesting, John. Yeah. I'm glad you bought it because I'm glad it's in good hands.
Next question from Sabaria Ahmad Khan. Dr. Valerie, could you share your thoughts on the symbolism and motifs on the boats?
Okay, so we've got this wonderful figurehead here, which represents the water spirit who was lurking under the water. And by having his head as a figurehead for the boat, the water spirit would afford protection to people in the boat. I can't really make out the motifs on this boat. I think you see similar dragon type motifs on the boat. Excuse me, I've got a little bit of cramp. I'll just stand up a minute. But you can see these dragon and dog motifs on the edge of the boat that are very auspicious and very typically Kayan and Kenya. And they're used to adorn important parts of the house as well as boats. And you can see them on costume as well today.
Do you want to take a pause and stretch?
No, I'll just stand up a minute, but you can give me the next question. Sorry, I've been sitting down for too long.
Sure.
Okay.
The next question is from a total stranger to you, I'm sure. Alena Morang asks, do you know anything about the songs that might have been sung or written during this period?
Interesting, Elena. So some of the songs which are very popular now among the Kayan and Kenya, like Pamong Jae and Lange Toyang, talk about coming together, about peacefulness and being friends. And people reminisce very much about traveling on the Baram in the 1930s and the 1950s, and people singing and having fellowship with their sapes as visitors stayed the night. And these songs have become a legacy now that young people sing today, like Elena, who's learnt them from Matthew Ngao and older Sape masters. And I believe a lot of these songs go back to the era of peacemaking, possibly originating in Indonesia. But the lyrics are very much social lyrics that celebrate togetherness and being together and dancing together.
Great. Next question from Ng Hong. Hi, Dr. Valerie. Are there any folk songs or oral tradition conducted during the event?
That's a good question. There are some narratives that have been documented by Tom Harrison about peacemaking, not this particular event, but earlier peacemakings, which came about as a result of the Badan coming into the Baram. And there was talk that there's discussion about the amount of cloth and other goods that were given to the Badan as part of these peacemakings, as if people were keeping accounts. So those are narratives related to peacemaking. The Kalabit have got narratives relating to periods of peacemaking and the making of blood brotherhood, not particularly this event. And another group called the Saban have narratives about people going to Marudi for peacemaking. So there are lots of oral narratives about peacemakings that we can put together, if you like.
The next one is more a comment than a question from Great Page Turner. It's just saying that it would be interesting to see an image of the trophy. We have a trophy titled the Rajas Cup 1909, but we are not sure if it's for horse racing or the regatta.
Oh, wow. The Rajas Cup 1909. That's from the Page Turners, because Gregory Page Turner's grandfather, I believe, was a resident in Sarawak. So the Rajas Cup, it could be, we're not sure whether it's horse, it could have been horse racing, couldn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
I was, as I researched on Padungan, half of Sarawak Gazette seems to be talking about horse racing in Padungan during that time. Next question from Bini Tan. Those teams that lost the race, will they fight against the different ethnic group? Had it happened before instead of the peacemaking event?
I've never come across or heard of people losing out. Of course, anything can happen when people drink too much.
Right.
But if you read Jose's account, there was a scuffle at the Marudi peacemaking. The Lirong wanted to provoke a fight, and Tama Bulan averted a fight at that peacemaking. But that was something that was happening when two inimical groups were coming together.
Okay, I don't think there are any more questions in the Q&A. Oh, yes, there's one here. Zafia Hamid asks, why were gongs an item used for exchange?
Gongs were items of considerable value. They were made of brass, and that was a currency in the old days. It was part of a barter system. Gongs were very useful things to keep because you would resound them in times of emergency. If there was a fire or if there were enemies, you beat your gongs really loudly, and that would cause alarm among the whole village. But they were important items of heritage. To possess gongs meant that you were a person of standing, and they were used as a means of currency, and they were also used as items of fines, and they were also used as items of bride wealth.
Interesting. I never thought of that. I have one question, I guess. If anybody has any more questions, I think we have time for maybe one or two more. But I have one question. Dr. Valerie, as you think of the main differences between the regatta in the 1880s, 1890s or earlier, and compare it to modern regattas today, what are some of the features or activities that you personally would wish had been retained from the old days?
I have to say very publicly that I long for the long dances to be continued with the sape music and the singing. Unfortunately, the locals tend to prefer pocho pocho, which is extremely popular and extremely sociable and extremely democratic. And it's Indonesian and people love it. But I really much prefer the long dance that was much more graceful. So that's one thing. And there's a beauty pageant that I could always miss. I mean, yeah, I could miss the beauty pageant quite easily. I'm not terribly bothered about that. I would like to have more singing, a traditional singing of traditional songs, but there are no longer people who appreciate those anymore. I think it's good that there's a revival of sape, and quite often there's sape playing and sape events together with the regattas.
I personally, I'm glad that tuber fishing was discontinued. Okay, if there are no more questions, thank you, Dr. Valerie. Thank you very much for your presentation and all your answers to all these questions. Before we go, I would like to thank every participant for your interest and participation in Spotlight on Sarawak, Talk Sarawak. And thank you also to our major supporter, Petra Energy Berhad, and also to our other donors, Criado Foundation, Cahaya Mata Sarawak Berhad, Cope Private Equity Sendirian Berhad, Centric PR Sendirian Berhad for supporting this endeavor. So I'm very pleased now to hand back to Vanessa of Badan Warisan Malaysia. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for being our gracious and engaging moderator for today's talk. Thank you, Dr. Valerie, for sharing your knowledge and providing us with fascinating insights on the history and meaning of the Baram Regatta, as well as the impact of its peacemaking legacy on Sarawak's culture and its multicultural community then and now. After listening to your talk, I appreciate the Baram Regatta so much more. It is an exciting event which I look forward to witness again. For our audience, thank you for tuning in today for today's talk in our webinar series on Spotlight on Sarawak, and for all your lively comments and questions. We hope you will join us on Thursday, the 19th of May at 5 p.m. for Datin Donna Drury-Wee's talk on Sarawak's exotic food heritage. If you have not registered for this talk, please visit Badan Warisan Malaysia's website at badanwarisan.org.my, and in the events section, you can register for this talk as well as the other 3 talks for the Talk Sarawak series. The entire schedule is also available on our website. Please follow Badan Warisan Malaysia on our website. You can subscribe to our newsletter, Jendela Warisan, or follow us on Facebook and Instagram for more information on upcoming events and news on heritage in Malaysia. Badan Warisan Malaysia is an independent non-government organization, and we do not receive any financial support from the government. If you have enjoyed today's talk and wish to support our educational and advocacy work, please donate to Badan Warisan Malaysia. Details are available here on the screen. Thank you very much in advance for your kind support. On behalf of Badan Warisan Malaysia, we wish to express appreciation to our donors, supporters, and the team behind our Spotlight on Sarawak series. Thank you again, everyone, and enjoy your evening.